Yeah, thank you.
Great to have you join us today.
My pleasure.
All right. Let me start by kind of crawling into your mind, your first time exporting. What were you thinking? Tell us, there must have been excitement, there must have been hesitation. What were the things that were going on as you made that decision originally?
Yeah, it was interesting. It was a little bit like Josh's first win. So we were a small technology startup, about a $5 million business. HP was our largest customer. And we essentially reacted to a big order. I'd love to say we had this great strategy and went out and closed this big piece of business, but basically they said, hey, we like your technology, we'd like to take it to these 5 countries. And we thought, wow, fantastic, a massive moment for a startup. You know, we're thinking eyes of going public and being a big business and an international business overnight. So that day there was a lot of high fives in the office, a lot of celebration, big party that night. And I'll never forget the next morning, I sat down at the time I was running sales and marketing, and our CEO, who to this day is still a dear friend, he said, hey John, I'm worried. And I said, what do you mean? This is like the best moment the company's ever had. This is what we've been waiting for. He said, no, you don't get it. He goes, we're about as international as the House of Pancakes. And I'll never forget that. He was right. Actually, we were 100% US. We had US blinders on. I thought, wow, what are we going to do? So he sat there and kind of shut the door in his office and just looked at this blank whiteboard and thought, okay, we got to come up with a plan. We're going to come up with a strategy. Obviously, we're not going to let HP down, but at the same time, we don't really know what we're doing. How are we going to ship this product? And it was a technology product. It had encryption standards, so that we knew there'd be some challenges in certain countries. So we thought back to some of the basic tenets we had in running the business, and one was we said, hey, we're going to run the business as if we're a public company today. So we had aspirations about being a public company someday or being acquired by a public company. Said, let's get back to that. One of the things we did out of the gate, which I think we did correctly, was we made sure we surrounded ourselves with great advisors at the board level, our tax advisors, legal advisors. So all right, let's start with them. So we put calls literally right in his office out to a couple of our board members, spoke to our attorneys, spoke to our accountants, and got some sound advice. And literally by the end of the day, we had a pretty good handle on what it was going to do, to what we had to do, and the licenses we needed to ship product into these 5 countries. And that quickly became something that was actually more of a strategic decision. So started reactive and then became really a kind of a company builder, where we decided, all right, wow, there's more than a market than just Hewlett-Packard in these 5 countries. We've got an opportunity to drive and to bring our product to other countries, other companies. So we set up offices around the world. We set up offices in the UK, in France, and then in Germany, and then in Tokyo or Japan. We went with distributors. So we had now, almost overnight, within a year, now we truly were an international business. So it started reactively. There was a lot of concern on that. We became a little bit more international than the House of Pancakes and ended up being really a big company maker. And at one point, our sales were about 40% international when we were acquired.
40%. Yeah. So I'm relieved to hear that it took a year to get those offices set up. When you said you had the answers by the end of the day, I thought we were going to make it sound awfully easy here today. So you mentioned a couple things in there, both how you had the opportunity, a big order kind of prompted you to go international, but also as you were thinking about the context, how it might impact your opportunities for acquisition and valuation of the company. Yeah. That sounds like one of the opportunities that may not be as frequently discussed. People tend to focus on revenue, and the revenue opportunity is obviously a big driver, but there's more to it. What are some of the other opportunities that companies have by growing global?
Yeah, great question. I think the biggest one, I think in life and certainly in business, we all strive for balance, and one of the ways you balance is diversification, right? So if we think about just how you invest personally, right? Whether it's a 401k or a 529 investment for college education, or even your just a mutual fund, right? Whether you know it or not, you're probably diversified. I doubt we all have all of our eggs in one basket, right? And in that diversification, you probably have anywhere from 10 to 30% of your money in an international fund, right? Whether someone like Fidelity's doing that for you or you're doing it yourself. It's very similar in business, having the benefits of diversification, knowing that, if the US market's down 1 quarter or 1 year, you've got an opportunity to hit a home run in other parts of the world, either through exporting or setting up a business somewhere. I think the other big one that we found, and we see a lot of companies that we help go international today, is just one of learning. I think in the stages of companies early on, you tend to, when you start first bringing a product to market in the US market, you do something that's really important. You listen to your customers. You go out and talk to customers, you listen, and you shape your product and service and delivery around the customer needs. And when I've certainly made this mistake myself, after a while you become successful, you're driving revenue, you've got employees, you're doing all the fun, you become a little bit more insulated. And that's one of the reasons I really enjoyed Joss's presentation earlier. You stop defying tradition. You kind of keep doing things the same old way. And I found in international, mostly because it's different customs, many times it's a different language, right? There's a different way of doing business. It forces you to listen, right? You almost have to ask twice. You ask a lot of questions, you listen, and you end up shaping your product a little bit differently, or your delivery a little bit differently. So I think that's another big takeaway. Certainly revenue is most important, then diversification. But I think just the lessons that you're going to learn from customers around the globe, you can really bring that back and strengthen the business. And that's something that doesn't necessarily show up on the balance sheet, but it is a big opportunity for every company in this room, and certainly one that I've benefited from.
And looking at some of the changing demographics in the U.S., there's also a lot of interesting opportunity to learn selling to those markets where now many of the American citizens are coming from, to be more effective even selling domestically as well.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So there's some great opportunities, but there's also stuff that freaks people out. There's some myths, there's some big scary stories out there.
Yeah.
What do you think, what do you encounter, what are the most common myths that you find companies worried about?
Yeah, I think some of the big ones, and some of them are real. I mean, certainly there's risks of doing business in Atlanta, right? There's risks of doing business in Detroit, right? So you have risk anywhere. But I think on the international, there certainly are heightened, just because it is a bit of a mystery, right? Oftentimes different cultures or different languages compound those the concerns and become big myths. But I think the biggest one from exporting is that, hey, we're too small, right? You know, that's the exporting is just for the big boys and girls. The reality is, and I think from Radius's perspective, the company I'm with now, you know, we work with over 500 companies that do business in other parts of the world. And I'm always amazed and really inspired by how small some of these companies are. Certainly there's big multinational firms, but oftentimes we see startups that just got their second round of funding where 100% of their revenue is international. And now they're going to think about doing business in their, in their home state, in their home country. So I think that whole one about, hey, we're too small is absolutely a myth, and one that it becomes easier and easier to debunk year after year. It's just easier to do business international now. I think the other one is just the startup cost of doing business internationally. You know, when we were at that company Connected with HP, we had our technology up in the cloud. It's kind of an early cloud provider. And really also was a bit of legal costs and some accounting work. It was just a rounding error, and all of a sudden we were international. So it's not that expensive. You want to do it right. You don't want to take any shortcuts. But I think those are the two biggest myths, that we're too small or it's too expensive. Anyone in this room can be doing business internationally, before the end of the year, before we're in the holidays, and really drive that top line for your business.
But will everybody in the room find international buyers? I mean, sometimes folks wonder, geez, is there a market for my stuff? Can I go sell it internationally?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think obviously the best way to go is to get pulled there by a customer, right? That's the the best way. And part of that is just kind of building your brand here domestically. It's much easier for international customers to find you than ever before, right? It's much easier. So that's part about building your brand locally. But if you're not that fortunate, you have to think a little bit more strategically and kind of do it the old-fashioned way. You have to go out and earn it. Then I think there are a lot of tools that you can use, starting with, ones that we did, we thought about other markets and big companies and small. It's just some basic stuff that we could find out literally this afternoon on internet searches. Starting with, okay, where are the biggest markets, right? What are the countries that are easiest to do business in for US companies? Literally, you can Google that and you'd have a list right from the Department of Commerce. Other things you'd look at is just tax rates, right? You obviously want to be as tax efficient as possible. But I think the most important thing is to start to think about and know your customer, kind of understand the persona of your customer in this local market. And the reality is there's a like customer or a like prospect in other parts of the world as well. So you start to triangulate those data points. If you're in a good market that has buying patterns much like your customers here in the US market, you've got a good opportunity to export.
That's a great point. And our next session is actually going to introduce a couple of the ways that companies can help buyers internationally find them. So overcoming some of that traditional hesitance about the effort and the initiative that's required to go out and actually find the buyers. There are some real risks. It's not just myths.
Yeah.
And a large part of your business is helping companies anticipate and avoid the real risks. Mm-hmm. What do you find are those that companies are perhaps least aware of, but can present the biggest problems to them?
Yeah. So I think that every country around the world is getting better and better at kind of collecting their pound of flesh, right? Getting their taxes paid, right? So I think that they're much more sophisticated. So if you're doing business in another part of the world, there will be a temptation to have that quick hit, right? To take that shortcut, just to do a little bit of business, and if it works out, then you'll square it away later, right? that is a real risk. You have to do things correctly right out of the gate. I think the biggest thing you have to do is get advice and start with the people, whether it's your board of directors or the people you rely on in your local market around things like tax planning. Much like you wouldn't blow off taxes here in the US market, like Uncle Sam wouldn't like that, you certainly do not want to do that on the international stage as well. So a big part of that is just kind of the taxes and statutory reporting, just like we do in our local market, state and local government or national taxes here in the US. Same thing on the world stage. We see a lot of companies that take shortcuts or think that we'll just get a quick hit and in and out of the country. That's where we see the charges really compound, and it's a painful experience.
So I often, that's a great point, and I explain to companies that are worried about some of those regulatory reporting requirements. Yep. If you're collecting sales tax in 3 or 4 different US states, you're doing the same kind of thing already.
Yeah. And there's probably one other too that's a little bit tougher that your tax advisor can't help you with, and most likely some of your board members can't either. And that's just the human element, right? So, here in the U.S. we're all employees at will, right? Which is kind of a fancy way of saying is that most of us, if not all of us, can be fired, right? If I say something crazy or stupid or do something crazy today, I could lose my job. I'm an employee at will at a great company, and I certainly hope that wouldn't happen. But on the world stage, that's not the case. There are much more protections for employees in other parts of the world. And I remember back to that company Connected when we were opening up these offices, and we tried to do it correctly. We said, hey, we're going to find people that have successfully done their role in the past. We put a lot of work into interviewing, reference checking, and we found this leader that was going to lead the whole continent of Europe for us, based out of Germany. I'll never forget Leo, a really charming guy, and certainly we were excited about having him on board. Had brought companies from the US into the local market before, and just seemed fantastic. So we noticed right out of the gate that we had that typical US-based, not very patient, hey, what have you done for me lately? Have you hit your quota this quarter? And then that quickly, kind of quiet for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, not much was happening. So I was growing impatient, the CEO was growing impatient, 6 months go by, almost a year goes by, and it's literally nothing. It's just all quiet on the Western Front. No revenue, no customer interaction. In fact, if anything, the customers are getting a little bit upset. And I did notice that Leo was a professional at taking vacations, right? He was excellent at taking vacations. So I tried to lay a couple hints down and say, hey, this isn't working out. We may have to go in a different direction. There's no revenue. We got upset customers, things like that. And finally, a couple things happened where it's just, we were done. So I got Leo on a Monday morning, tracked him down. He was in the Alps skiing with his girlfriend at the time, Monday morning, right? It was a Friday afternoon. And said, hey, Leo, we're gonna make a change. We just have to go in a different direction. Let's make this as smooth as possible. I'm sure you understand, et cetera, et cetera. He said, John, what are you doing? I said, well, what do you mean? We're making a change. He goes, are you firing me? I said, well, yeah, Leo, I'm sorry, but we have to fire you. We have to move in a different direction. And he said, hey, listen, there's a way to do this in the German market, right? I thought, well, yeah, there's a way to do it in the U.S. market too, and that's what we're doing. And he said, well, I'll have my attorney send you some paperwork on later on. So I thought, all right, that's fine. But a week later, it was like the New York City phone book of paperwork shows up, and sure enough, we were wrong, and he was right. There's a whole set of things and process you have to go through and councils, and I swear that company was probably paying Leo for the next 5 years, right? Because we'd made that one little mistake of firing an employee over the phone, which you can do in the U.S., you certainly can't do in other parts of the world. So I think the human element, both selecting the right person, but also making sure that the life cycle of that employment is managed correctly, is a real risk internationally.
So the human element's an important point, and let's circle back to the opportunities. The statistics are really impressive about the vitality of companies that export, the fact that they tend to pay higher wages, and that there are benefits across for all the stakeholders associated with that company. Yeah. We talked a little bit about increasing valuation, about the potential for the strategic asset of global diversification and that sort of thing. Yeah. What other impacts do you see on companies that grow their exporting that are positive for their business domestically?
Yeah, well, I'd actually like to touch on the valuation one a bit. I think that just to make sure we drill that one home, and if you think of, obviously as small or medium business, even large businesses, we all think about exit, right? Exit could mean turning the business over to a family member. It could mean getting acquired. It could mean going public, right? And all of those things really are about, all right, what's the exit value? And a tremendous way to drive value is back to that point around diversification, because I think the way I look at diversification is around balance, right? So it's preventing that down quarter. We all hate the, hey, wow, we got a big quarter, big year. Oh, but wow, that was a tough year. Great year, tough year. That isn't a predictable business. That's not a very valuable business, right? When you take those bottoms out, because you're diversified, and if one theater is on and one theater is off, you can still kind of bump along and get that nice predictable revenue up and to the right. That drives a tremendous amount of value for your firm, right? And I think international sales is a great way to do that. We see companies that, kind of a rule of thumb to think about from international business in terms of percentage of revenue. And I've seen both sides of this. It certainly depends on the type of company. But, that first year, you should almost plan on 0, right? If you're pleasantly surprised because you got an inbound order, that's fantastic, right? But first year is really planting the seeds. When you get into year 3, it could be around 5 to 10%. You get into year 5, it could be 15 to 20%. You're out in year 10, it could be 30% of your business. And when I speak to this isn't just slicing the pie differently. That's truly incremental business, right? I certainly wasn't a math major, but I know that if you grow your business 15% 5 years in a row, you've doubled your business. Now just imagine doing that on the international stage. So it's not that difficult. The buying power is out there. So I do think the biggest point I wanted to hammer that home today is just driving the value of your business. You can do that outside of your neighborhood. You can do that outside of your country and start thinking about doing that on the world stage. It's easier than ever before. And the other thing I'd like to just highlight is the opportunity cost of not doing that, right? So we're all in markets, some large, some small. We all have competitors, right? So think of it, if you're not servicing those clients, whether they're your clients who may already be international or new prospects, your competitor probably is. So think about the opportunity cost with that as well. So I think there's a great opportunity to drive value through diversification and through taking your business, defying tradition, as Josh did a great job of pointing out today, and going to other parts of the world.
And you mentioned buying power. I think the statistics, probably everyone here has heard them. 95% of the world's buyers are outside the U.S. 70% of the income for consumption is outside the U.S. There's a huge amount of buying power. Yeah. But for companies that see that growth in export sales, according to that model that you outlined there, the other piece of it, of course, is not just revenue, but profitability. Are they able to sell profitably into international markets?
Yeah, and that gets back down to getting advice and thinking about it strategically. Obviously, if you get pulled by a customer into a certain market that may be a little bit more complex or difficult to do business, like a Brazil or a China, your margins are probably going to be under a little bit more pressure there, right? There's just the taxes are higher, the complexities are higher. But the other parts of the world would be a heck of a lot lower. So that's things that, once again, this is not a mystery, right? The answers are out there. People in your network today have those answers. There are businesses that are built just to take businesses internationally, whether it's exporting or actually setting up those businesses. So that's an important consideration. Much like we think about the difference between cost of doing business in Atlanta versus Detroit versus Silicon Valley. You have to think along that if you're going to put a sales team somewhere, put a manufacturing plant somewhere, you'd want to do that same type of analysis, and there are a lot of people out there that can help you do that in terms of doing business in Germany versus Hong Kong versus Singapore versus Brazil, for instance. But yes, there is a pretty big swing, but we see companies absolutely drive and sometimes improved profit margins in other parts of the world.
So then a slightly different version of some things we've already touched on. There are reasons why companies hesitate, but then there are reasons that companies give for why, oh, well, exporting isn't for us. And some are legitimate. I mean, not every company should be exporting, but some are too convenient. What do you hear as kind of the weakest excuses for companies not exporting, where you say, you know what, if we could just sit for 15 minutes together, I'd be able to show you that's not the case?
Yeah, I think it's it really just boils down to laziness, right? Not doing the research and thinking, oh, it's just too difficult. Not me. The big boys are only for the big boys. Some of the things we mentioned earlier in the talk. So I think just not doing your homework, right? Which is dangerous in any business in any part of the world, right? And not being ambitious and not going for it. So I'd really chalk it up to just sheer laziness and kind of getting stuck in the old way of doing business. And that's great if you've got a business that's rock and rolling, printing money, fantastic. Most businesses aren't that easy.
And getting stuck is easy. That's why it was so great to hear what Josh had to say about that necessity, just continuously innovate.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, a couple sentences. Let's boil some of this down. The biggest risk that you see companies worried about and not worried about that they should be?
So the biggest risk we see people worry about is just that the unknown tax burden, right? Whether it's exporting or setting up business, and just the fear of trying to understand that, comprehend it, and size it, right? I think the other one that companies don't worry about enough, and I certainly didn't, and have the whip marks on my back to prove it, is the human element, the HR element. It is different in different parts of the world. There are different levels of protection. There's different levels of customs that you have to understand, and cultures. And there's also just a different level of patience that's required doing business internationally. So we see a lot of companies miss that.
And how about the biggest opportunity that they overlook?
Yeah, I think it gets back to that diversification point. And I think the real big one that's overlooked is just what you're going to learn on the international stage, because it's going to force you to listen to customers more. It's just different, right? Different language, different customs. You have to be there. Sometimes you'll be there over the phone. You can Skype it, but obviously face-to-face is best. You're going to learn more about your company. You're going to learn more about your products. And most importantly, you're going to learn more and have a better roadmap for your future.
So now let's talk a little bit about the ideal size. Is there an ideal size for a company that's exporting, or does it not matter?
It really doesn't matter. I mean, there are some dependencies. If you're a manufacturer and you're going to be very heavy on setting up a manufacturing plant, and if you're, in order to support your customers, they have to be close to that plant. That's a big decision, right? Putting a plant somewhere. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're a technology company that has your technology sitting up in the cloud, and as long as anyone has a browser, they can access that technology, there's almost no excuse not to be worldwide. In fact, there could be someone looking at your company right now from another part of the world. You could go international by the end of this week. So it really does, there is a mix, but one of the nice things about the business of Radius is that we have a front row seat to that. So we see a lot of companies at different stages, not-for-profits, universities, large multinationals, and we have companies that just got funding that are 100% internationals, international, to companies that have been in business for 100 years, have a couple offices, and only 5% are international. So it really is all over the map, but I think about, probably the good measurement is how portable is your asset. And don't also think just of a product. There's a study up in the United States Department of Commerce. Actually, the majority of exports are service-oriented, not necessarily product or widget-oriented. So it doesn't have to be a product to export something, your physical movement of goods. Oftentimes, it's actually a service or an advice that you're actually exporting to different parts of the world as well.
So across the entire middle market range, you don't think there's any limitation for a company, whether it's 10 million or $1 billion, to really begin exporting?
Absolutely not. And I say that just from personal experience, having run companies doing that, and also now helping companies do it. It's wide open.
So if companies have a broad opportunity regardless of their revenue range, how about target markets? What are you all seeing at Radius in terms of trends of markets that companies are interested in, and markets where companies are successful? Yeah,
so it boils down to two tracks. If your customers bringing you there, you don't have a whole lot of choice unless you want to refuse the business. You go to where your customer's bringing you, right? And that's typically a larger market. If you're planning on going somewhere, so you're thinking strategically and thinking about, all right, where do I want to bring this business? Then you can kind of take a deep breath, get advice, and start to look at it. You really should start just with good old-fashioned GDP. Where are the bigger markets? We see a lot of companies follow the GDP. They'll go to the UK first, right, which makes a lot of sense. Less of a language barrier, though it is different, as we heard from Josh earlier today. Germany's another one. China's a big one, but more complex. So they'll chase the big market and then think about ease of doing business in that country. And once again, this is all public information. And there's a lot of ways to kind of put your big toe in the water too, starting with exporting, starting to do some international marketing. We're going to hear a little bit later today about trade shows, how those can be an important vehicle to kind of learn and interact, have 50 meetings in a week as opposed to 1 or 2 meetings if you're flying around the world. So there's a lot of ways to kind of pressure test what market's best for you. The best, of course, is winning business, right? But short of that, chase the large market and then look at ease of doing business.
So ease of doing business on one side, how about barriers on the other side, avoiding markets with substantial barriers?
Yeah, that's a really good point. There are massive markets like China and Brazil that do make it more difficult, right? But there's a tremendous amount of consumption going on there, so it's really tempting to go. And we have a lot of clients that go to those two markets. They just find it's a little bit more difficult, right? Because there are some real barriers around the complexities, and also, for instance, if you're going to do business in China, and once you're there and you want to start to do finance and accounting and balance your books, you have to use one of the 3 approved accounting packages by the Chinese government, right? and they're not necessarily ones that were here in the U.S., right? So just kind of adapting. And I know most CFOs like to have one accounting package, one system of record, things like that. So that's just one small example about some of the complexities in other parts of the world. So I think that's a very good point, Ed. You want to look at certainly opportunity driven. We're all capitalists by nature, right? We're all running businesses and driving revenue. So that should be job number one. Then I think number two should be, all right, what about these complexities and what are some of these risks? And then underneath those risks, what are some of the costs?
And current GDP and projected GDP are good guidelines to use. Do you find companies actually digging into the demographics to try to anticipate from a demographic perspective where very young populations will likely be growing even faster in the next decade?
And I think that's when you start to map your product or service right to your customer. And demographics is a real important one. And that's why, obviously, I'm sure that was one of the drivers for you with India, right? And that's a very difficult, there's a lot of stories, and I've had some challenges there too. Also had some great success stories there too. But that obviously is just a fast growing, young market, highly intelligent, consumption's on the rise, so a lot of drivers that go in there. So I think that's when you start to get demographics, you're starting to map your product or service, examining your customer here in the US market, and then looking at other parts of the world where we have a like-minded customer.
So this is fascinating stuff. Unfortunately, we're out of time now. We need to stay on a schedule because of our live cast to make sure that folks joining us from elsewhere are on track with our schedule. So we'll need to stop here. I'm thrilled that John was able to join us, and for all your benefit, Radius is available for some of the sessions in the Expo Center over there, and John will be floating around today as well, and I'm sure happy to chat with you and answer questions.
Absolutely.
So thank you,
John. Thank you, Ed.
Thanks very much.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you.